I'm not. Oh, are we? Oh, yeah, I think mine's a little hello. Okay, yeah, I think this is. Oh, test. Uh, it, yeah, still. Test. Well, if there's somebody online who won't. Hello? Hey. Oh, no. There it is right at the. Even have kind of fear. So, yeah, thank you, Clerk McLean. Yeah, and are we still recording? Yes. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so my apologies to everyone who's listening out there. We were having some issues with the audio. I think they're sort of solved now. So we'll start with the City of Lake Forest Park City Council Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, April 20th, 2026. And at this moment, I will call the meeting to order. First off is public comments. I don't see anyone in the room. Okay, so I think that closes public comments. All right, so the discussion items for tonight are twofold. First, we're going to hear from our clerk about the proposed generative AI, artificial intelligence use policy, and then we'll continue our discussion regarding the city financial outlook and budget strategies. So, Clerk McLean. Oh,
Okay, seems to be working. I think as long as we talk, I think maybe it'll cut out the feedback. So this policy, well, I guess first off, do I need to explain AI to anyone?
I think for the benefit of the audience, generative AI especially, that would be good.
Generative AI basically is something like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, where you can ask a question and it'll give you a response. A lot of students use it to write papers. I used it recently when we were talking about putting something on the website for possible levy. In the previous levy, I created trying to put the spreadsheet on the website. Couldn't get it to work, so I had to code it in HTML and JavaScript. So this last time with the current spreadsheet, I put it into AI and said, make a website. And it just snapped it right out instead of me spending hours on it. So that's kind of the gist of what generative AI does. And I hate the term AI because it's not really AI, but whatever. The purpose of this policy is it goes into the employee manual and basically protects people's sensitive information. So nobody in the city should be putting any personal information of anybody into any AI chatbot or what have you. Any identifying information, names, birth dates, anything like that. I should not be doing that. And so I needed some kind of stopgap. If they do get caught doing that, we need some way to document that and take actions appropriately. The other thing, and this is the biggest issue with AI, we have no way to capture anything that any employee puts into any of these information systems. So for a Public Records Act, it's a huge problem. Basically, we have to put all the employees on notice saying that anytime you're using it, you have to keep records of what you did in case somebody puts in a public records request and asks for what prompts you put into the bot, and basically do that. So that's the biggest issue. Really, that's it.
Good.
Microphone.
I agree that there should be a policy. Can you tell us where you got this policy?
Yeah, I basically copied another jurisdiction. I actually copied Puyallups. A lot of jurisdictions have them.
So I noticed there's, obviously they can't put anything confidential on there. This applies to volunteers as well. Is there guidelines that can be shared with any volunteers that may be interested so that they can know better what they're not allowed to put out there?
Sure, we can do that. That's not a problem.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us this policy. I suppose that there's two things I'm looking for in the policy. The first is making sure that any staff members are verifying the information before using it, and I think that's already in the policy. So that's good. And then the second, wondering if would it be appropriate for there to be a prohibition on having the AI output go directly to the public? Basically, what I'm trying to avoid is a situation where someone in the public asks a question about permitting and they're given the AI answer as opposed to an answer from a human staff member.
Right now, there's two problems with that. One, we don't have any AI system that's interfacing with the public. Two, I can't control what is out there already. So if someone puts how do I get a permit in Lake Forest Park into Chat GPT, I have no control over it.
And that's not that's out of the city's purview. I'm thinking more of if a member of the public emails a city department and gets an auto response that's AI generated.
I would hope. I can't. They should be double checking what's sent out beforehand. I can't control every employee, but if it becomes an issue, we'll address it individually on the employees.
So two questions. One is, and this one may be beyond the scope of this policy, but maybe fodder for further discussion in terms of the use of AI generated art or video or other things for public outreach. We've got a lot of artists in town, and there are a lot of artists who are just concerned about the use of generated images. There are copyright issues with the databases that were used to train, and for text also, and then concerned that there are people who could be contracted to produce art for the city or for other users who then are losing out to that. So I would like us to be thinking about a policy to, there are advantages to human-generated art beyond the fact that it's human-generated. And then the other question is, I know I've seen reporting on systems that some of the vendors that serve police forces and other specialized tools that are, that can help write a police report based on, you plug in your body cam and it scrubs it for audio files, it transcribes them and does a bunch of the work on the back end. Does this address that? Or would there need to be more work done to sort of?
Phone's on. The PD has a different AI policy. I have that in front of me. So I don't know what they're using it for, but I would hope they're not using it for that, but it's possible. As far as the art thing, that would be the purview of the council, whether or not you wanted to outlaw that completely.
And would that be something we would do with this, or would that be
I would say that's a different city policy. I mean, we can probably point it in with this policy, but this is mainly supposed to go into the employee manual.
That's not.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, does the city license any AIs today?
No, we do not.
Just the one that's native in the Office suite? that
Yeah, and that's not even paid for, so it's just the free version.
It's just the free version.
Yep.
Is this policy intended then to tell our employees not to use AI in their job?
If I had my choice, I would say no, but generally I can't, people are gonna use it regardless. They're gonna find ways to use it. The only thing I can do is try and minimize the damage as much as possible.
I guess my concern is that if it's an unlicensed version of it, any material that's submitted to the AI becomes the property of that AI and can be utilized by those models to do whatever they want.
Exactly.
So it feels to me like our policy should probably be stricter, that you can't use AI models that are consuming that data. While we were sitting here, I quickly scanned the use agreement that's associated with 365, and because it's a government account, everything that's submitted is segregated off to the side, not fed back in. That feels to me like the only safe AI to allow our team to use, although it's not the most capable or effective AI that's out there. So.
Yeah, I haven't talked with our IT manager yet, so I was trying to get a list of approved AI models.
Got it. That was going to be my next question. Thank you.
Right. I do appreciate that you do have, cities must not use anything that it hasn't been approved. So working on that approval policy with IT, I think it's kind of a next step, but I really appreciate that in there. And again, with contracted vendors, we may want to consider a policy where they have to note and ID anything that is AI generated, just so that coming from them, at least then we can speak to the community as what is and isn't AI generated versus human generated. And I think you may sort of suggested in here, but that like no AI generated document can be the final document. And I think maybe just more distinct language about that it always has to have that human final review before going out. And I know that you can sometimes go through and see, when it was generated, what it was generated originally by, and it'll usually say the AI, and then, who's the last one to update it. And so, just to make sure that there's that policy that they show that they did in fact go into the document. And yeah. And then again, if we want to attribute any AI content we make on our website, that may also be a piece of this policy that we want to think about introducing.
I'm going back to the question about something that's auto-generated off of our website that's AI. I don't think we have anything that does that right now.
No, not at the moment.
So I think that what we're looking at is an AI policy that affects internal employees and external contractors. So this is the first step for employees only, and there will be more to come with this as far as accepted AI models and examples that.
Yeah, I can do
Okay.
more research on for contractors and that, like.
All right. And thanks, Clerk McLean, for your, starting this conversation off. I think it's a good jumping off point. I guess not to put you too much on the spot, but for instance, you just mentioned a perfectly legitimate use for AI. And I'm wondering, would this policy have affected your use of the example that you gave of generating the web page?
Yes, because I had to save all my prompts. So I think I had a series of 20 prompts in there just to keep it, somewhat readable.
Yeah, because I wouldn't want to basically throw out a perfectly legitimate tool because just blanket get rid of it without realizing there are some benefits to using it, but keeping the guardrails on there to make sure that, we are cognizant of those kind of dangers that lurk. And so, yeah, I think this is a great discussion. So I think, what's our next step on this?
I don't believe they have to approve the employee manual, do they? I don't think so.
Yeah, at some point it does come back to council for their acceptance. I can't remember the exact vehicle. Shannon brings that forward. And so once you bring it in, it will be brought before council to adopt as the final
There
version.
will probably be another resolution to adopt it.
I would say next steps probably are to do some additional research and bring those answers to the questions you had tonight back before we proceed to bring that in. And then, like I said, there are several policies that Shannon's been banking that haven't been brought before council, just for your concurrence.
And, as city employees, we're held to the same standard. So anything that can help us understand what we can and can't use as well would be incredibly helpful. Thank you.
And as always, if, this conversation has spurred the brain juices of all of us and we have questions after the meeting is over, may we send them to you directly then? Okay, great. So everybody, yeah, if you have anything that comes up, let's say by the end of the week, get them to Matt. Thank you. Okay, so our last topic is the continued discussion regarding city financial outlook and budget strategies. And I think there was going to be one slide. Two, technically, yeah. And that was supposed to be sort of a hot mic take, sorry. All right. Any case, sorry, folks, we're waiting for the presentation to come up, so we'll be a couple minutes.
While we wait, there's a thing that I've been thinking about that I can just mention. I don't think it needs debate here, but just plant a seed that I think last year, before I was here, I remember there was some outreach to the public through the mayor and maybe through council, just about the budget process and sort of where we were and making sure that people were along for the ride of whatever decisions might be coming down the road. And we should probably be thinking school year's almost over, so if we wanted to do anything with PTAs, farmers market's opening soon, Pack the Park is coming, there's going to be more and more events, and it's probably worth thinking about our schedules and how what that might look like. So we don't have to do that now, it's not on the agenda, but I just wanted to plant the seed.
So yeah, the presentation's up, and I think the city administrator, you were going to take us through this?
I know, I wasn't ready for Mike. So following Thursday's meeting, I thought that there were three key points based off of what Councilmember Riddle had said of getting to the point by this date of whether council is going to pursue a levy in the future at some yet to be specified date. And so working back from that, based on the discussions we had last week, is really identifying the dollar amount that the council wants to see in the Strategic Opportunity Fund. Your reserve target currently by policy is 16%. You know that you are currently holding more than 16% in there, and so you don't need to rewrite the policy, but I think it'd be good to have some discussion about, do you want to aim higher than that? Even though 16 is your minimum, do you want to aim, that's roughly 60 days. Do you want to aim for 90 days, somewhere around whatever percentage that is, 20? Somewhere in that range. And then those 2 points, and then to discuss, is this council, is the new council to a point, desiring to go out for a levy in the future, and then identifying a date, is that in 2026, is that in 2027, when does that occur? I think at that point, once we know those items, then we come back in the future to start discussing, and I think there's got to be a lot of public outreach as well to help you understand where the public is, but that will help you set that levy rate. And you'll need to understand, we can have future discussions how much you're going to have in unallocated fund balance. As you remember in the past, Director Vaughn has talked about cash flow unanticipated costs. And so there's a lot to consider, but we do have the spreadsheet for you tonight. I have dialed it way back. There was a lot of muddying of the waters of talking about strategic opportunity fund and, using that for other uses where basically that's how you're sorry, I said strategic opportunity fund. I meant to say budget stabilization. That's basically your unallocated fund balance. That's how you're stabilizing your budget, and that's how you'll continue to stabilize your budget without a levy until those dollars are gone. I've also taken out or just hidden the cells that talk about levy. We're not there yet. We don't need to confuse the conversation with you haven't even decided if you're going to go out for a levy. And so once those decisions have been made, we can start to work that back into the conversation. I think anything else, Deputy Mayor? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, City Administrator. That's a great summary of what we've been talking up to this point, and categorized in such a way that we can understand the order of steps that we need. So, as I said, tonight's discussion is not going to be about whether to pursue the levy or not. It's going to be about those first 2 points, the reserve target and the strategic opportunity. Basically, how much in each are we going to put in? And I think, Finance Director Vaughn, please correct me if I make a mistake saying this, but when we decide the purple and blue boxes, that is, say, the Strategic Opportunity Fund and Reserve Target, they will be part of a budget amendment that will come before us sometime during the summer that trues up our budget to basically make sure that the actuals meet the budget and all that kind of stuff. So it's separate from any kind of levy action that we take, and that way, we keep those two things very clearly distinct. All right, so to kick off the discussion then, I think, and again, I'm going to defer to Budget and Finance Chair Riddle, that we were talking more about basically setting sort of a policy towards guiding us to what the Strategic Opportunity Fund being. And I think Deputy Chair Goldman basically mentioned something about essentially making the Strategic Opportunity Fund as large as our reserve. Was that one of your ideas?
Yes, yeah, at our meeting on Thursday, just saying if we aim for 16% for the reserves, then also aiming for 16% for opportunity.
And to that end, I think one of the things that Councilmember Rosno mentioned was basically that the Strategic Opportunity Fund is our way of investing in the city and making the lives of our residents that much better. And it gives us something to hope for, as opposed to the continual dread that we have a structural deficit and so forth. So I think there's merit in what you both say. And so I wanted to hear other people's opinions about that.
I'd like to see what the numbers look like if we were to do that 16% and in the Strategic Opportunity Fund.
As you know, 16% reserves in 27-28 is going to be roughly $2.4 million. It's 239. I'll just put the exacts. How's that? And the one thing that it shows you, if you look in 27-28, your unallocated fund balance is $1.4 million. And then the very next biennium, you have a negative. The second that anytime you have $1 million or less in unallocated fund balance, as I mentioned prior to Councilmember Rosenau's comments, you start having cash flow problems. One-time funds come up. That's an issue. In 29-30, if you had a negative $1,065,000, that means you're drawing that out of your reserve amount. Now you're at 8% instead of 16%. So you see the large impact that would have on the funds.
Right, so you're speaking of row 26, right? Thanks.
But wouldn't, just to make sure, since that's a negative balance, we've already eaten into the reserve in order to just simply come out to a zero, and then to provide that $1 million of flex, then that's the rest of our reserve. So essentially, by the end of 29-30, we have zero reserve. We just have the amount of money just for our balancing.
In 29, if you remember, and the way this works is this 3.9 million is your balance from the prior biennium.
Okay.
Balance minus required reserve of 2.5 million gives you 1.6 million. And then you still need to balance the budget. It has a negative deficit, or not a negative deficit, a deficit of 2.4 million. So you're short $1,065,000 just to balance your budget. So in that biennium, you're dropping your reserve amount to 8%.
Mhm. And that last 8% then can be that cash flow. So essentially we don't have a reserve per se, a
That's
robust
really,
reserve.
really dangerous to have your cash flow be your required reserve. And remember, at 5% is state law
Yeah.
for your required reserve.
Just to show how dire it is at the end of just that biennium.
I think just in case, I'm sorry, I just went in to explain. I just want to make sure that the conversation that we're having about cash flow, just in case somebody from the public comes just to soundbite like this meeting, the cash flow conversation that we're having is about the bulk of the general funds revenue comes in through property tax, which I think is commonly known. We're known as a bedroom community, but that's the bulk of the dollars. So what happens is that when that comes in October, it needs to help carry you all the way until you get that next bucket of revenue coming in April. And in January, you have some very large one-time invoices where you're paying for the year. So as we talk about cash flow, we're talking about being able to make sure that the city can pay for the regular expenses that are on a monthly, bi-monthly, or annual basis that will be within that time frame, just as a soundbite to make sure that when we use these terms, that everybody's following with us.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm not 100% about how this works, but if we put 16% into the strategic opportunity fund, there are some requirements in order to use that money. And it looks like it will deplete our reserve by putting that money in there. So we'll actually be short, we'll be at a deficit sooner. So possibly 16% is not the right amount. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm just saying it, we need to have the money that's liquid to be able to be used in case we need it in the reserve. And if so much is tied up in the strategic opportunity fund, just a thought.
I would also make the point that Administrator Hill, if you were to put a zero into the opportunity fund, that even with no money going into the opportunity fund, there's still a red entry by the 31-32 biennium. And so if we do nothing with opportunity, in 5-6 years, we are still eating into our reserves. That leads to the broader conversation about a levy that's not directly for tonight's meeting, but I do want to point out that that is the sort of Damocles that's hanging over us at the moment.
And I think that doing it this way, we may wind up in a situation where we would have to move things out of the strategic opportunities go away because we have to backfill the structural deficit. And that's a choice that we may, if we have to make it, we would be physically making it, right? We would actually be moving money among funds to show this is a choice that we've had to make because of where the situation has gotten to. If a levy doesn't pass, if other revenue streams don't materialize, which I don't know what they would be, but it's probably just the one. But that I think to me, that's an advantage because we're showing very clearly to the public what those choices are as we're making them. And I think that being really transparent about how we're going through this and what the choices before us are, and then what the choices before them are when that time comes, is going to make it a much cleaner process.
Yeah, and so I think for me, thinking about the strategic opportunity funds was also, we've talked about it being kind of related to one-time funds. And I just don't know if the finance director has had a chance to kind of look through and see how much of our current unallocated funds are one-time funds that would be moved to that, and whether that would be more or less than that 16%, but I'd be interested in kind of having a ballpark number at some point to kind of, that way, if it's one-time funds, it goes into strategic opportunity fund where we have one-time opportunities, and that makes sense to me that we marry those two uses together.
Are there not restrictions about taking money out of the strategic opportunity fund?
No,
don't-
that's at council's purview. And if I could, by way of example of one-time funds, because we had this discussion last week, you know, when the town center sells and money comes into REIT, that's a one-time fund. I think we also discussed that it would be difficult to identify, say, CARES and ARPA as one-time funds because those were offsetting lost revenues to the city. And so while they're, you know, by definition, one time, you're probably never going to see that again from the federal government for something like that. They were just backfilling a loss of gas tax and sales tax and motor vehicle tax and, you know, just all of that. And so it really kind of put us back just in a chunk. We got more all at once than you normally would see. And so you think, oh, windfall, but it really was covering several years of lost revenue to the city.
I mean, to build on that, I find the idea of unencumbered one-time funds to be a mythological creature. So I liked it when it came up Thursday in that conversation, but the more I think about it, it's not the reality of how all this operates. So I'm with Josh here. I think we need a representation of the budget that shows the community our commitment to wanting to do interesting and positive things in the community. I think City Administrator Hill, there's already $835,000 in that fund. So if we were to take it,
It's about 376,000. The council contingency fund is about 810,000. Different funds. And that one is highly restricted.
That one is highly restricted and encumbered. Got it. I think the point is right. We need money in that account. We need things to aspire to. As I talk to the community, I hear a lot of feedback either about the waterfront park or this professional building here and the idea of a main street that could come through this area. We need to sell a vision for what the city can look like and could look like. Setting funds aside and designating that, even if we feel they may be fleeting and have to come back into the general fund, I think it sends the right message to the community.
To return to the number discussion, which I've said this before, and it's still true, it's hard for me to, I mean, the 16% is a good heuristic, but it's not, in terms of like, I don't know what we might be spending it on. And so it's hard to put a number to it, because if it's too small, I think I said this last time, if it's too small, then that just restricts the opportunities that we see even, right? That's how luck works. It's, if you think you're lucky, you notice something lying on the ground. The Lakefront Park, we spent $500,000 on it, but it was a $5 million sale. So somewhere between there seems right, but it's, you know, I'm not sure, like, other than that 16% heuristic, I'm not seeing something that guides us within that. But that heuristic is not necessarily related to what we're actually trying to get at. And so I wonder, it's premature to be talking about projects, including the fact that we don't know if anyone wants to sell any of the things that we might want to buy with it, or any of the, or if the public would go along with any of these things, right? Like it's, but what would it, if we have a rough idea of what we might like to do, professional building or something else, what do we need? I genuinely don't know. I doubt that 500,000 is the right number for that. I don't know if whatever the number was, 2.3 million is the right number, or is it more? Is it, it's hard for me to wrap my head around that, and I'm not sure if there's a way to frame that discussion better.
And I'm going to give you some gentle pushback on that, in the sense that we need to have something in mind if we're going to set a number that's not the 16% heuristic, as you say.
Oh, how to do.
Right. And so I think, part of our discussion needs to be, what is our vision for this place? So in other words, if we want, as Councilmember Muhlenberg was talking about, the civic campus slash Main Street idea or whatever it is, I know that there's a big contingent that want pickleball courts, for instance. But my point is basically that having something like that in mind and being able to put an order of magnitude number at least on that, that's what I'd like to see. The reason I went for Vice Chair Goldman's idea was that, well, we should be putting as much into the investment in our community as we do for our rainy day fund, as it were. And I think, that would be my floor. Okay. But basically, yeah, if you can think of some way in which we can get a dollar value, or even just basically some kind of rubric where we can actually assess, what do we want, approximately what should we put in here because we're trying to do this, then that would be great. I think basically something is tangible, say the professional building, where we can get an assessment for and figure out basically what it's worth and what somebody might be wanting for it is not a terrible thing. Even if we don't get that, it puts us at least in the ballpark of what if the Windermere building, or some other building in the city, right? So.
Yeah, I think that's one way of thinking about it. Like, just what can we get for what amount of money, at least in today's dollars, just to kind of frame it into how much of an opportunity can we get. One of the things I mentioned last Thursday was 500 works really well. What if it's just 500 per biennium and we start with 1.5 million? Again, that's kind of just a rubric based off of the history of what we were able to achieve with certain amount. It doesn't look forward, but it kind of looks back. But it gives us, again, another sort of metric that we can refer to. It's hard for me to understand what things we might be doing in the future that we can kind of see. I mean, professional building maybe, but that's harder for me to visualize, and how to pick that thing to determine the amount. But that's just harder for me to visualize.
All of these are really good questions. And I think that to your point, that Councilman Muhlenberg, is that we need to find out what our residents have in mind. What are they thinking about the future of the city? I think it's important to have them have buy-in for whatever we do. And then that way we can determine on what amount it is. I'm not opposed to it at all. I'm saying that we're sitting here brainstorming on what we think, but we need to get a better idea to what our residents think. So maybe some additional public outreach, and we have a potential town hall. We don't know if we're actually doing that as a special meeting or not, but it could be a perfect place to start the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to hear public input on strategic opportunities. I also think that we as a council can help set the ground rules by putting a pot of money into the strategic opportunity fund. And let's say if that number is $2 million, we can, as a council, decide to partition that money out. Then when we're going to the public, we can say, hey, we have a $2 million in this fund. What is your vision for the future of Lake Forest Park that can be implemented with a price tag of approximately $2 million? So I do think the first step is we should set an approximate amount and then go to the public, because if we just say, what's your wish list? Some people might propose things that cost $50 million. Others might propose things that cost $50,000. So I do think it's important for us to kind of set the order of magnitude ourselves, then go to the public and say, what would you do with this pot of money? How would you make LFP a better place?
Well, I just wanted to bring up, I agree with that. We want to guide them on what is going on. There are some things that are brewing in, amongst all of us of what we're working on. And I think maybe bringing forth those ideas of what is cooking it with the council might be a good way of framing the narrative of what we're thinking, because they don't have any idea, unless they're doing one-off conversations with people, what's going on. So they don't know that we have certain things that we're thinking about and that we want to accomplish. So let's put those in a framework and use those possibly as a model.
I would just go back to the 500,000 we set aside and actually used to secure the lakefront park. Think of this as seed money. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the professional building. You put the whole lump in there, that's not enough. To purchase it and refurbish it and make it whatever it is you want to be, and then where do you go from there? And so I would think of it as seed money. What do you think is a good dollar amount in there for seed money that could help you pursue things without breaking the bank, so to speak, being able to operate your city and not setting up expectations that might be unattainable if you have to move it back into your unallocated fund balance.
Yeah, I like the idea that this is an opportunity fund because we don't know what's coming, right? It's allowing us to pivot quickly. We create the policy for this. So if that means that we want to put some more guardrails on it, or we want to leave it more open, do we want to require some sort of community engagement, do over a certain dollar amount versus what we can do on our own as council? I think we can start putting some guardrails on this with the community is what they feel comfortable with. You know, if we put 2.4 million in, can we just spend it all at once without having to come to the community? Probably not a good idea. I think in bringing some community engagement into this policy may be a really good idea, especially for future councils, because they can't read our minds, so we have to put it in policy. So I think we can find a balance where our authority and coming to the community can be balanced with this, which means the specific dollar amount that's in there. To me, I feel like having more in there, like either the 2.4 or $2 million kind of in, you know, that higher range makes a lot of sense. And then again, something happens, we can pull it out as council and bring it back into unallocated funds and back into to budget if we need to. But once we pull it into the budget, we can't make it back. We can't create it again.
To that point, thinking about numbers and sort of extending the idea of the reserve, or we could say sort of three biennia. If we're thinking about a levy, 3 biennia worth of reserve, like this is what we would be. This is the gap that would be filled. I guess that wouldn't be the reserve. That would be. I'm trying to do this on the fly, but you get what I'm saying. Three biennia worth of something that would be then that really does visualize the choice. That would be sort of at least the upper end of what we plausibly could do, that because that comes to something like 7.5 million, which is most of that unallocated reserve then. So that brackets it at the other end. We could also do 2 biennia worth. And then at least at this point to have that there. And then as the process, if I'm understanding the process right, we could today sort of pick that as a goal, something like that, 4.5, 5, somewhere around there. And then in a month, as plans gel a little bit more clearly about all the rest of it, we could say that's not a realistic number, and step it back, right? I mean, we're not setting anything in stone, but we should pick something that we're talking about so that the conversation proceeds. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if we pick something now, and then as we go through a process, if we're going to do the levy, what the levy rate is going to be, hear more from the community, we can continue to be flexible. I think it's just we need a starting point now to be able to move forward and be able to have further discussion. Otherwise, we're just kind of chasing our tails a little bit around these different numbers.
So I guess just to have that thought, I would say somewhere for me, somewhere around 2 years worth of reserves or 2 biennia worth of reserves makes sense to sort of take a strong stance of like, let's dream big. And then maybe we hit reality, or maybe we can put a foundation under that castle in the sky. And then see where the process plays out. But I would lean towards somewhere in the vicinity of 4.5.
So Councilmember Rosen, I'm trying to track with your 2 biennia of reserves. That today, that's not something that's even feasible. That's something that requires a levy to pass. So in your 27, 28, your reserves that you need to have on hand is 2.4 million. You recalculate that in 29, 30, you're still using that same 2.4 million roughly and adding, 132,000 to it. Because your 16% reserve requirement is tied to revenues or expenditures, whichever is greater. So this is one time, unless a levy passes, and depending on what levy rate you choose, you remember that the levy that just recently failed was to cover the gap. It was not going to enrich the city grossly. It was to cover the gap and put a small amount in there for inflation. And so anything beyond this one-time infusion that you can do is a much deeper conversation later. If you decide to go for a levy, are you going to ask for more? But then how do you message what you're going to do with those additional dollars? If you go back to prior levies that were more put out on promise, trust us. I think we heard a lot through the survey that went out last fall, that the community really needs to understand what it is they're getting for their money. And if you can't wholly articulate what you're buying with that, if it's to say, put X millions of dollars into a strategic opportunity fund and we'll do something great for you in the future, you're going to have to wrestle with how that is messaged. But as for today, yeah, you don't have the opportunity to do this every year in outgoing bienniums. You have one time right now, and then it becomes a discussion for future years based on what revenues you're collecting as a city.
Since we've talked all of this through, I'm more in agreement with Vice Chair Goldman that it's easier for us to tie it to a percentage of our minimum at 16%. That makes sense it makes more sense, I would think, to people when we explain it, that this is what our minimum is, this is what we're putting aside, which is our minimum, and I think that works for me.
And I think, as we can see here for 27, 28, the unallocated balance is about $3.8 million. Hearing what our finance director has said about having that cash on hand to balance the cash flow from like property taxes, a maximum of 2.8 million before we start impacting the city's ability to just manage cash flow. That leaves no dollars to partner with the levy amount. So I think in a way, remembering that if anything we bring under that 2.8 million is money that we're putting into the pot that would potentially lower the levy rate some. So balancing, because that's all the money we have really at that point. So I'm leaning again more towards the 2 million, 1.52 million, and not quite taking us to the full 16%. Just because we also heard the community say during the last levy, why aren't you spending your own dollars to balance your budget? And why are you only coming to us for like the full gap? So for us to be able to have any funds left over to partner in filling that gap, we have to be less than the 2.8. And I think 2 million or might be the place to go, or 1.5. Again, it's a conversation.
Different thought, not on that, but as you consider the strategic opportunity fund, remember you do have a balance in there. So is it that plus this, is it 1 million? So it's 700,000 plus that, so just to remind you, you have about 371,000 in there.
I mean, and I agree with the comments that have been made so far. I think basically that if there is nearly 400,000 in the strategic opportunities funds, one of the things that I think we're losing sight of is that, as Vice Chair Goldman said, we want to set an order of magnitude number. We don't need it down to the dollar, right? So 2 million sounds really clear. And adding the 370,000 in puts us pretty much right at that 16% reserve. So I'm gravitating towards the high end of your range.
And I did just pull up from last Thursday's meeting. I think the budget stabilization fund is the one at 373. The Strategic Opportunity Fund is the one at 810. So I think we do have more, yeah, I think we have those numbers backwards in our head. I don't know, I'm looking at the PDF. Because I don't trust myself to remember things, so I look at PDFs, to be honest. But I'll let them noodle. But yeah, I mean, if we're just, if we target the 3.4, or sorry, the 2.4 with whatever we have in balance and we add to it.
I'm sorry I misspoke, and I'm sorry, Councilmember Muhlenberg, because I misspoke to you. Strategic opportunity sits at 786, and budget stabilization's 354. Remember, we have some extraordinary expenses going out in legal costs right now, so other budgets are going to get hit. I threw the 2 million in there. It seems to be some gravitation towards right now, and that puts you upside down after one biennium. So just.
So if we were 2 million with the, so 1 point.
Yeah, 1.6 mil, can you put 1.6 million in there?
1.2.
1.6.
1.6? Oh, okay. Well, I guess we were targeting that. I was looking at the anticipated balance at the end of the year. 1.6. So that's,
You're still.
yeah.
Not as much.
Yeah. But so that would, we would be bringing that full 2.3, well, 2 million of what we have in unallocated reserves this biennium we're talking about would apply to 2930. So we'd be bringing 2 million to the table to offset 2930. And then we don't have any more to offer.
So essentially, yes, we've delayed it by about a couple, well, by doing that, we delayed 2 years.
Yeah, we delay it, like we cover us another biennium.
And I am struck as just that exercise, moving it by 400,000 it's not buying us time in a meaningful way. But it does, like, that's almost what we spent on the park, right? It is, like, that is a definable amount of opportunity that is captured in just that shift, even which then translates to not much in terms of time or flexibility to balance the budget at the other end of it. So, I mean, I lean towards, I think that a nice round number and being able to say this is to go out on the 20th, or to go to a PTA meeting, to go to community events and say, let's dream big. What would you want this for? And then how do we get there from here? And how do we manage all the rest of this so that we can get from A to B? That, to me, I can wrap my head around that. Yeah.
Are there any other comments? Oh, go ahead.
I would just say in 2930, you're in this scenario, you dip below 16% reserves.
Well taken, thanks. All right, so any further discussion? All right, does staff have enough to proceed forward?
I don't. I don't know where we are, honestly. I mean, if 1.6 is the number that you want to put in there and start having discussions around that, great. I advise that that's a large number, and it causes you problems in your second biennium. I would also remind you that those general fund expenditures in 27-28 are projected. We don't yet know for sure, and I've got a few contracts coming before you that are going to increase those. So just keep that all in mind, is you don't know the true costs of 27-28 until we start bringing the budget forward this fall.
So the sense I'm getting from the council is if we put 1.6 million and we add that to the approximately 800,000 that's already there, that gets us to 2.4, which is close to the 16%. So that's kind of the motivation for 1.6 of new money into the strategic fund. I would also point out that I'll be blunt about this. With a levy, it's a question of when, not if. Because even if we do absolutely nothing with strategic opportunity, we're buying ourselves 2 years at most. And we need to be thinking on that horizon. And so there is going to have to be a levy, whether it's this year, next year, that's for us to decide. So I don't want that. I don't want that to scare us away from using the Strategic Opportunity Fund. We can go to the community and say two things. One, we want to dream for the future. And two, the reality is we're going to need your help as the public to get us there.
Here, here. And I will just remind the council that if we were to go out this year, we start collecting next year. If we go out next year, we don't start collecting for a full year. It doesn't you don't get half a year out of it. So thinking about, we need a levy, and then when do we go out for it, and how that's going to impact this progression of our next 3 biennium, and where the cash flow is coming and going. So are we at the green yet? Enough?
I do want to point out that staff is doing a little bit of research on your last point, so yeah.
Oh, no, actually, we got that research back and she is correct. That, yeah, if you pass a levy mid-year, at any time during the year, you don't collect it until the next year. So if it's a November ballot, you collect it January. If it's another time during the year, you still don't collect it till the following January. Yeah, I don't think we need to linger on the reserve target. I mean, if you're going to identify that much money going into Strategic Opportunity Fund, I think you aim for your 16% reserve target. That's been policy for many, many years. So yeah, I think you're down to green.
Any other final comments before we adjourn?
Wait a minute. I think Councilmember Riddle, to your goal for tonight.
Yeah, I mean, do we have enough to, one, start researching if we're going to be doing it this November? What do our deadlines need to be? What do we need to be looking towards? And versus if we want to wait for another year, again, looking at that. And two, can you pull the spreadsheet back up real quick? Just one of the metrics that I'm thinking about is when we get to that very last end of our 3132, we want to have our reserve met, and then we do need to have some of that flexible money in there for cash flow. It's currently, the way we've got it with our current suggested Strategic Opportunity Fund addition, we're at minus 3 million, right? So as we're pursuing into the levy, one of the thoughts I'm having is, okay, what's the ideal number for that that's going to put us in a healthy position to move into the next biennium? I don't want us cutting it close personally, because then we just have to have this, conversation all over again sooner than we would like. So thinking about leaving us in a healthy position at the end of these 3 biennium, or 3.5, depending on when we pull the trigger on pursuing a levy. So if you want to think about what that means to you, then that will help us then figure out a levy number along with the Strategic Opportunity Fund number.
And to add on to your point, it's a really good point that you raised. In fact, by choosing that number, that pretty much sets the levy rates. So that's basically why that number is so important. I think Councilmember Good, you had a question.
Yeah, my concern is that moving ahead without any public outreach would potentially set things up for not a good ending. So I'm just cautioning my fellow council members on reaching out to people is all.
And as you mentioned, I think on May 20th, there's a town hall, and certainly I think Clerk McLean's already announced it as a public meeting, so we can all go, and I hope I see a lot of you there, because you're right. I think basically it is time to come clean. What are we going to do with this?
To what I said in that sort of, while we were paused, I would love to have, I don't know if we want to do some sort of formal survey or input website, not something that we bail out, but something on the website that we can gather feedback of, like, what are people's dreams? What are people's wants? Not to pick a number necessarily, but to start to get that input as we do outreach to cap, this is my nonprofit advocacy brain at work. You go out to your presentation, you want people signing up, you want people putting something in information somewhere. It can just be conversations, of course, but if there is a way to capture that, and if there's budget materials or other, like a brochure or signage or anything else that we can do to sort of announce, hey, we're doing coffee with the council, we're doing those sorts of things. If there are things that the city can produce, or the web videos, other things that we can circulate, that would be really helpful for me.
So I would say that the survey we had done is not stale. I think that very well spells out what the community wants to see. Um, as far as timelines, if you were to go out in August, you got to get on it today. Because not in August, I meant to say November, because August is when we have to have all the work done and to the county. You're going to have public engagement, coffee with council, coffee with the mayor, town halls. The chief and I tried diligently to carry this and, do that and interviews and things like that. But this is really going to have to be, boots on the ground, community level, meet people where they are to get there. And that all has to be done. I mean, we're talking May, June, because by July you have to adopt a resolution. You have to telegraph people that, yes, you are going out. And then everything starts up in August to move towards that date. And then the silent period comes, et cetera. We have all the stuff from last time. We can easily produce flyers for coffee with council, coffee with the mayor. If you go over to Kenmore City Hall, they're hanging up there every day. They do it all the time. And so those are the types of efforts that are going to be necessary. So the question, I think, for the council is that something that you feel that you can take on between now and basically September, October to get that message out, knowing that it's a budget season as well? I can tell you that the first levy we did, and this was during COVID, so that's not the best time to do a levy, but we started around May. And that is a really short runway to get the messaging out to people. I think you've got a lot of people to reach and help them understand that a lot of people still think the last one passed. And they're surprised when they find out that it failed. So I think there's a lot of homework to be done. That's why I think November is ambitious, but that's up to this body to decide.
I would say from finance chair, it would be ideal to be able to hit that November so that we can start bringing in that revenue in the next biennium, rather than waiting that extra year, because we barely really don't have a lot of extra year to wait before we're in trouble. So that's just my thought, and it is going to be a lot of engagement in a short period of time. I will say, if we were to try to push it off to February or March, with the holidays there, we're really not gaining a lot of time for engagement. So I'm not seeing a huge value in pushing that out with the negative effect of having the revenue come in a year later. So if if council's interested in moving forward, I would advocate for November and getting us out there now.
With the town hall coming up, may I suggest that we come up with some sort of agenda of points that we would like to bring up with people? I don't know if pursuing this so soon will land well. It may not. It may backfire, but I don't know.
This is conversations until we sign a resolution, and that's not happening right now. So I think, yes, let's get out there now and let's start talking to them about this. If we don't, then we'll never make the November, and but we have to start talking to them now in order for us to know what is going to be on a resolution. So it is the public engagement period now, not the we have a decision we're sharing with you period.
Yes, I agree. We need public outreach. The spreadsheet, and I'll tell Administrator Hill, I really like the streamlined version. It was really easy to have this discussion tonight. That spreadsheet scares the crap out of me. And we need to tell the public, we need to let them know why we are so scared about the city's financial future. And I think that is the foundation to getting more people to support the levy, to recognize that we are in a really challenging situation and we're not going to get the federal government to help us out. It's unlikely we're going to get the state to help us out to the level we need it. So regardless of what decision we make, we need to have more of this public outreach. And I like the idea of coffee with council members. As the weather gets nicer, I'd really like to see us do it outside of City Hall. I think there's a bit of a bias in that the people that can easily make it to town center versus if we do it at roaming parks. Yeah, we do one coffee at Horizon View, one in Southern Gateway. Make it easier to get to people where they are, to explain, and we need to figure out, numbers. It is daunting. How do we convey the gravity of the situation? Regarding the levy, I would also point out if we decide not to do November, as Administrator Hill said, there is no difference between a February 27 ballot and an August 27 and a November 27. We can make that decision. So really, the decision as a council we need to make, do we go for November 2026 or do we go for sometime in 2027? Recognizing that if we go for 27, the levy rate will have to be proportionally higher because, as Councilmember Riddle said, we will have lost a year of potential levy revenue.
Yeah, and I agree about things outside City Hall, outside Town Center. There's now another coffee shop at Local 104. Good spot to be as people do school drop-offs. Being in the parks, there are other civic events that are happening, block parties, all the rest of it, try to get ourselves invited to. And we should be, I would say we should be doing that regardless of whether we're doing a levy, but the levy adds urgency to it. But people don't understand what the city does and what the county does and who's responsible for what, and like all the arcana of the 1% cap and these funds and all the rest of it. But other than us nerds, they're not following this. And so to just making sure that people understand one advantage of going out if we were to go out this November, Kenmore is doing one, is working towards doing one in November. And it's what cities do. It's not like we're in dire straits, but we're not unusual in that. It's not something that we did. It's just how state law works that cities wind up here and then they go out for a levy lid lift. Kenmore's doing it at the same time. They're doing some stuff. We can sort of piggyback on some of their outreach. They can piggyback on ours, and that may be helpful in terms of timing also, if we decide to do it then. But yeah, regardless, I think we should be doing this. And I was going to ask Clerk McLean, I think the website for the last round of it, I'm not sure if it's still on the website or if it's been unpublished. I was looking for it because I wanted to send someone a link from something to it.
No, it's unpublished.
Okay. It might be useful to have that in some archived and clearly, these numbers are from a previous year way, but just to be able to point to like, this is the structural stuff that goes on. These are the conversations that are continuing. Something like that, if not to put work on people to update it, is my main thought here.
Is the current spreadsheet available online?
It is not, because it has been changing constantly. And so no, and until we're in final form, which sounds like we may be, then we can make it available. I would want to put some very descriptive instructions on how to use it and what it means. So it could take some time to get it up, because unless you're walked through it, you have no idea what it's calculating. I think you could easily get lost. And so I think there's some cells that should be locked and just let the user just be able to do the input and watch what changes.
Like for example, if we were to publish it with the 16% or whatever the amount is that we decide on and have that cell locked, maybe it would be easier for people to see how things pencil out.
Yeah, I mean, in its current form, it doesn't have to do anything beyond, well, you don't see it anymore, but you said 1.6 million. I plugged it in, it shows. And so I think it's a little premature until we have some discussion on what your messaging would be about the Strategic Opportunity Fund and kind of your goals for it. But we could put some narrative together just so people can see that, yeah, in 29-30, you're in a hole. And if you don't invest anything in the community with the dollars that you have, it gets you another year and then you're in a hole anyway. So, but yeah, we need some time, so it's not up.
And I think we may even be able to simplify it just a wee bit more for kind of public consumption, because we have a lot of intermediate calculations that are shown that can be confusing. Because you really want to know where we are and where we're at the end and what are the numbers do for us. I also want to recognize that, next year would be an election year. It's going to be harder for people to devote time if we were to do something in the August or November. And I think that was possibly a challenge in the last one. It was just, people only have so much time in their, the city elections. Yeah. People only have so much time in their life to be able to do things during the summer and the early fall. And it's hard to get that outreach engaged as well. So I think this summer we have more of a chance to do some real good engagement than perhaps during a council election year.
And another year would also mean another year for the state and county to add to people's property taxes, which would not make it easier either.
Anyone else? Okay. So I think at this point now I'll ask again, staff has enough information?
We're good now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, sorry on jumping the gun earlier. But yeah, I think we've had a really productive conversation. And I think what's kind of nice about this is that we're now approaching this in the way that I think makes most sense, which is as Chair Riddle said, we want to know where we're going to end up, and then from that we infer back what the levy rate is going to be, and I think that's a much more sensible way of doing stuff. So appreciate all of your contributions to that. I think also one last comment on Councilmember Roseno's idea of going out to your various communities, because we are one community here in Lake Forest Park, but we are comprised of several communities within that. So whether it's PTA or Rotary or whatever, I think basically get out to your particular community and please talk this up a bit, because I think it's vital that everybody understand where we're at. And again, as you said, irrespective of the levy itself, we have this fundamental structural deficit that we do need to address very shortly. We lost a couple of years of runway there, but now basically this is when we have to act. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay. All right. There are no other items on the agenda, so I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you. See you Thursday.